Hello, my name is Paul Gavriluk, and I'm a host of the Spiritual Perception program. Today in our studio we have Professor Taylor Coolman, who teaches systematic and historical theology at Boston College, and who has been working on the topic of spiritual perception for many years. And today we'll be discussing the role that the spiritual sensorium plays in the life of the age to come, or what the Christian tradition refers to as beatitude. So Boyd, tell us a little bit about the way in which the tradition has reflected on this highly controversial concept of the resurrected state. What's at stake?
It's very interesting, Paul. Let me begin with two different sources from the Middle Ages that I think are very interesting and have an interesting sort of theological intuition about this. The early 13th century Parisian master William of Auxerre was one of in the Middle Ages one of the foremost exponents of a robust doctrine of the spiritual senses. Begins, and in fact, the place where he has his most extensive discussion of the spiritual senses is in his discussion of the next life, or in beatitude. And William there offers a very rich discussion of beatific experience through what we call the spiritual senses. At one point he says it like this. He gives this description of the spiritual senses in beatitude. He says, "We will delight in the beauty and the symphony and the aroma and the sweetness and the suavity of God. And these are all delectable things in God, and all these things pertain to the spiritual senses." So William here gives a very interesting, rich discussion of the soul's experience, the spiritual experience of God in the next life, using this language of, first of all, the spiritual senses of the soul, but also these various attributes, the divine attributes that the spiritual senses encounter. And there are five, and not accidentally. In another text that I'm not quoting here, he correlates those different attributes with the different spiritual senses: sight, hearing, smell, and so forth. So William has this discussion of the soul's experience. Now, almost exactly at the same time, in the early Franciscan intellectual tradition, there's a discussion of the incarnation and whether or not the incarnation would have occurred even if there had not been sin or fall. And several early 13th century Franciscan authors argue for the affirmative to that question, that in fact there would have been an incarnation even without sin. And one of the reasons that's frequently given by some of those authors is that if there had not been an incarnation, the physical human senses would have gone unfulfilled. They would have never had the possibility of encountering God in God's human nature, incarnate, and thus would have never experienced beatitude, never had the chance to be fulfilled as physical senses. I think those two vignettes, coming from almost exactly the same time period in the Middle Ages, are instructive and interesting because in their own way they both suggest that the human senses, both spiritual and physical, are implicated in beatitude. They have something to do. They're activated. They're actualized. They are active in the next life.
So in a sense, the experience of the resurrected state is an experience that paradoxically is on the one hand spiritual, because you're perceiving realities that often we associate with even mental categories, right. But on the other hand it's somehow sensuous, right?
Exactly.
Is there something in Scripture that would also yield that kind of understanding?
Exactly. Well, one wonders, for example, when in the New Testament the Apostle Paul refers to the resurrected state having spiritual bodies, that the resurrected will be raised. They die as physical bodies. They're raised as with spiritual bodies.
Does spiritual body mean it's not going to be material, or what are we to make of that?
Right. Well, I think there's a lot of uncertainty. Paul doesn't give us as an extensive discussion or a definition or description of that as we might like. But the phrase spiritual body is a little bit paradoxical, and so it seems to suggest on the one hand a body and something that would be recognizable as and in some way continuous with the bodies that we currently have. On the other hand, the adjective spiritual seems to suggest some sort of change, something different from our current experience.
So in the resurrected state, therefore, there is a sense in which our body would retain its identity and some kind of link to the body here and now, but on the other hand would be transformed.
Transformed, exactly.
And so what does that then tell us then about the functioning of the senses in the resurrected state?
Right, exactly. Well, it's speculative, of course. You know, we don't have a lot of data or a lot to go on, but it seems to follow that if there is some way in which the resurrected state is a kind of a unification or an integration of both body and soul, a spiritual body, about some way in which our current experience of corporeality and spiritualness merge in the next life, then it stands to reason that perhaps also what the medieval tradition talks about, though, as we've just been referring to, of a description of spiritual sensation and physical senses, perhaps those in some way merge. Perhaps they are integrated in the next life in ways that are hard to imagine in the present life, but perhaps are suggested by certain things that we think are going to be true in the next life, such as a spiritual body.
So this deep union that you're pointing to, of on the one hand, spiritual aspects of the self and physical or embodied aspects of the self, and this sense of deep union also was, as a result of that, was the divine. What kinds of implications does this have for our existence here and now, for this present body, with all of its imperfections, etc.? What can we?
Well, I mean, I think one of the interesting things to think about would be that if as these texts, both biblical and then later in the tradition, as they suggest, if there is some kind of continuity between the present life and the next life, then perhaps it stands to reason that the kinds of formation, the kinds of practices, the kinds of training of the senses, the kind of growth in virtue, and the cultivation of a kind of a capacity for spiritual discernment and spiritual sensing would be relevant for the next life. That that those things that we currently pursue and currently cultivate in this life have a bearing and have a connection to the next life.
So there is a sense, therefore, in which this life becomes a kind of a training ground for what would be ultimately fulfilled in its fullness in the eschaton. Well, thank you for your insight into this very vexing and complicated question on the matter of the resurrected state. And thank you for your contribution to the program. We're looking forward also to reading your material and particularly your publications in Thomas Gallus pertinent to this discussion.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.